Hello and welcome back to 4th Age Guides. Today we are taking a look at the Chiefdom of Rhun, one of my favorite factions, if not my favorite faction in the mod 4th Age Total War Dominion of Men. We are going to handle this 4th Age guide a little bit differently in that I'm going to split this up into 2 battles instead of just 1. This is a fairly large faction with lots of unit options, and so I want to make sure I give you a sense of what you can expect maybe in the early game and then some later game combinations for you. So to start, we are looking at an early game battle. This involves the Kingdom of Adunabar, and the battle map here is the Rhun Sea, I believe. So the Sea of Rhun is over there in the distance, and here we have a fairly flat, fairly open battle map. This is the type of battle that you will tend to face in the early game before you have a lot of your higher-end units. Although, when you start the campaign, you will have some high-tier units already trained for you. For example, you will have your Tier 4, which is your highest tier, War Wains. You will also have some Tier 3 Riders of Rhun. You will start with some Tier 3 Spearmen of Rhun as well. So here we see the Kingdom of Adunabar approaching. We've got the high ground here, and we've started off the battle with some ranged units out in front. Now, if the Chiefdom of Rhun has any disadvantage, it is in the ranged troops. You can train slingers eventually. This version here is actually the kind you can train only in North Rhun, but in reality you have access to them through mercenaries very early on in the game, and I recommend picking them up. We also have archers, but this is it for the most part. Now, as we can see, I'm going to be swinging out my left, which is my cavalry, and my wains to deal with the advance of this cavalry push on the part of Adunabar. Wains are basically a chariot unit. They have size on the wheels, and they scare nearby enemy infantry, and they have javelins. So those are all great things. I love this unit. They're probably my favorite unit in the entire game, but they definitely have their drawbacks, and one of those is maneuverability. As you can see, we're going to get stopped by a lot of my own units. So this move here, swinging them down after the cav, is very risky, and it's going to result in the loss of a lot of my wains once we get caught, but I was willing to do it for the sake of sniping the enemy general here, because wains will chew up enemy cav. The Riders of Rhun, again a Tier 3 unit, sword and shield, pretty decent all around, but they're not super effective in the charge. Spearmen of Rhun are probably your best early game unit in terms of melee, just for the staying power that they have. They tend to have better staying power than these Axemen, which I've used to make up the center line. But the difference between the two really is the Axemen, which are a Tier 2 unit, have War Cry ability. So they can actually punch above their weight, in that if you time it right, you do the War Cry, and that gives them, I believe, a +10 bonus to their melee attack. And then you charge them in, they've got about 20 or 30 seconds there where they are doing a lot more damage. So if you use them right, they can be surprisingly effective. But here I've put my Axemen in the center, Spearmen on the flanks. And I have also used some of these Easterling Warband, which are a Tier 1, just your basic fur-clad barbarian. But at least they come in large unit sizes, so they can sort of tie up lower tier enemy infantry, while your other cav moves around to flank and get a nice charge, like these Eastland Raiders have. Rhun isn't necessarily a cav faction, but we saw that at Tier 3 they get those Riders of Rhun, and at Tier 2 we get these Eastland Raiders. They at least have a spear, which will help them in the charge, but they're not going to be super effective in terms of staying power. Your general is also going to be a cav unit, very similar to the Riders of Rhun. They have swords and shields and good armor, but the big difference is that they also have javelins. I've already thrown all the javelins for this particular unit. It is a risk using them in combat, however. They do not have the staying power of the generals of other factions, like, say, the Reunited Kingdom, Adunabar, Rohan, Dale. So you want to use them carefully. Make sure you use those javelins, and then get them around to deal damage on the flanks. What else do we have here? I also have brought a couple units of Easterling Skirmishers. These are Tier 1. And Skirmishers are a great unit to use, especially against Adunabar, where those javelins are really going to help, and where, since Adunabar usually brings a lot of heavy but slow infantry, you can bring 2 to 4 units of Skirmishers, stay out of their way, and do a lot of damage to them. But as you can see, we've managed to win this fight mostly just by doing a lot of flanking, doing a lot of the typical stuff you would do. But it's important to remember that with Rhun, you have a lot of tools in your toolbox, so to speak. You've got decent cav, you've got some ranged, you've got good infantry, and you have some interesting options with things like the war wains, but you don't have any overpowering single units, in my opinion. You don't have any one arm of your force that is much better than all the others, so you really have to get used to using all of them together. One of the things I'm doing here is my surviving wains, because they cause fear, they've actually really helped to facilitate that mass rout, and so I'm pushing them towards the remaining enemy to keep them running and to encourage them to leave. So that is, I think, all of the units that we brought to this fight. I'm just going to speed this one up. We'll take a quick look at the results, and then we'll go to the second battle, which is a bit later in terms of army composition. So we did a lot with the Riders of Rhun. The War Wains didn't get too many casualties, but again, the thing you want to use them for mostly is morale. So morale shocks and attacking cavalry when possible. Of course, wains are vulnerable, as we saw. They're also vulnerable to trees and rocky terrain, so you want to keep them out of there when possible. So this next fight we're going to look at involves Dale. And this is, as we said, a later game fight. Dale is a pretty worthy opponent for the Chiefdom of Rhun. They have a very similar army in some ways, in that they have a lot of strong arms to their forces. They have good cav, whereas you've got decent cav. They've got really good ranged units, where you have so-so ranged units, and they've got really strong infantry, where you've got some decent infantry. So fighting Dale can definitely be a challenge. Now, this particular fight is a little bit different. We've got some units that can only be acquired in certain regions on the map, and this is one of the very fun things about playing as a Chiefdom of Rhun. These Horse Archers of Khand are available only in Khand, as you might imagine, and as you expand into these different geographical areas, you find different options, more so than most other factions. So it's sort of a fun game of expanding and seeing what you get as Rhun. Now, these are a Horse Archer unit, of course. They also have spears as a backup weapon, but the problem is they've got a very small unit size, only 33 men here. So you want to use them in large enough numbers to make an impact, but they are also very vulnerable in melee, in my experience. So what you want to do ideally is weaken the enemy with archer fire while avoiding archer fire yourself, and also getting a good charge in with those spears if possible. It's not always possible to do that. We don't have anything different in the ranged area, but we do have some different options in terms of melee. One of these is these Spears of the Shadow that I've put on each flank. These are an excellent unit, and you can tell they look quite a bit different aesthetically from the other runic forces. This is because this is a cultic unit. Rhun is one of only 4 factions in the 4th Age that can quote-unquote convert to the Shadow Cult, and you do this by expanding into territory that has predominantly cultic alignment, so places that have a lot of cultic temples, or you can build those yourself, as opposed to your own native cultural buildings. We'll talk about that more in the campaign video, but the cultic conversion ultimately has the effect of changing your roster. So instead of those Spearmen of Rhun that we saw in the last video, you would have Spears of the Shadow. Instead of Riders of Rhun, you would have Axemen, Axes of the Shadow, and so on. There are some other differences, and we'll look more at those a bit later. But the thing is, you can actually mix and match, because cultic conversion is not only a one-way process. So if you build your own native temples and cultural buildings, you can actually go back to your native roster, and so it is possible for you to have the best of both worlds. So here I've got some of those Spears of the Shadow, but we also have some Eastland Darkhelms. These are pretty solid. These are a tier 4 infantry unit, and like the Axemen, these guys have War Cry, so that's going to give them a bit more attack power. We also have brought some Vassal Macemen. This is a unit you can find in Nirn, which is pretty easy for you to get, actually. They have maces, which are good against armor, and they're more of a Dunedainic style unit, which stands them in very good stead against other troops in terms of their defense. Another unit you might pick up is Easterling Axe Hurlers. These can be found in dwarven settlements. Swords, great armor, shields, and throwing axes. So a very interesting, versatile unit, more for the late game. In the second row of our infantry here, we've got Great Axes of Rhun, another Warcry unit with two-handed axes, which makes them good against armor. These can only be recruited in North Rhun with a specialization building. I definitely recommend doing that when you can, because this has a lot of advantages. They come in a larger unit size than other units of a similar tier, like, say, for example, your Axes of the Shadow. And they also get a combat bonus in the snow, so if you time your invasion right, that can help a lot. Also, one of the most effective units in the game, especially for Rhun, Berserkers of Rhun. There's only a few factions that can train Berserkers. I think the Uruk Berserkers and these guys are it. So definitely make use of them. Once you Warcry with them, they are gone, so they're going to go out of your control, just like vanilla Berserkers in Rome Total War. But they are superbly effective in that role. So train up these guys and definitely make use of them. The last unit that we haven't looked at yet is Chief's Men, and you can see them over here. There's the spear-armed chainmail cavalry unit. These guys are available in Northmen territories. So, for example, Dorwinian or Dale, those types of territories. And they're a great unit to have because they really fill that gap that Rhun kind of has for a higher tier spear-armed cav unit. They also carry clubs as a backup weapon. You can see some of these guys right now. And they've just got really good staying power, even against some of these higher tier Dale cavalry. You just mob them up and send them in to do their work. Over here on our left flank, you can see we are holding out fairly well against some of these high-tier Dale infantry. And again, in the late game, Dale is definitely capable of putting together some fantastic armies, which are difficult to beat. So you're going to see a lot of Black Spears, which are kind of a hybrid unit. They've got spears, of course, but they also have throwing spears. And so you've got to hold them with your own infantry and send in their Berserkers. That's definitely my advice. I've also got these Dorwinian Halberdiers, which are the guys who are running away at the moment, and they're also a solid infantry unit. But you see what happens once these Berserkers get stuck in. They just go nuts. They rampage all over the map, and the enemy tends to rout quite handily. However, you may observe we've taken some losses, quite a few losses. The Vassal Macemen are down to about half the unit strength over here. Great Axes of Rhun down by about a third or more. And we've lost a ton of the Horse Archers of Khan. They just got absolutely chewed up. So let's take a look at what is remaining here. Casualties sustained, Chief's Men, Great Axes of Rhun. Eastland Slingers lost a lot. Well, that's because I just let them get charged. But the Horse Archers of Khan, you know, it doesn't take much to do a lot of damage to a unit that only has 33 men on large unit sizes. But they did decent for themselves. Again, a lot of the killers are going to be the cav units. But that's sort of a nutshell of how you could set up a battle with Rhun versus Dale. So what I'd like to do now is go into the custom battle and just take a quick look at what we have not seen for units. So this is basically the totality of what Rhun has, and you know, excluding things like mercenaries and levies and so on. But first, let's look at the cultic things that we may have missed. So cultists are one. This is available at cultic temples of a certain tier, and they're basically just a kind of a druid unit. They are useful for improving the morale of nearby units. Honestly, I never really train these guys. It's almost always better, in my opinion, to bring another melee unit or another cav unit to the fight. Another cultic unit for you is Grand's Men. This is a very interesting unit. These are scaled up hammer wielders, basically, and they frighten nearby enemy infantry. They're effective against armor. Only available in the settlement of Barad Eden, which is just east of Mount Doom. So if you conquer into Mordor, which you almost certainly will, you can pick these guys up if you remain cultic. We also didn't see some of these guys. Swords of the Shadow, Axes of the Shadow, Shadow Riders. These are some of like your basic cultic lineup. Some of these are going to be just available to you along with the Spears of the Shadow, basically in your homelands if you go cultic. Others, like Swords of the Shadow, will require a specialization building. But for the most part, these are very solid but very expensive units. Another that we didn't see is Retainer Spearmen. These are a pretty rare unit. Some of these vassal units, like the Vassal Warhounds, the Retainer Spearmen, these are available in very distant territories. So the Retainer Spearmen you can find in Umbar, which is very far from your starting position, and the Vassal Warhounds are available in Dunland. So if you go to these places, sure, they may help you a bit, but it's very unlikely you're going to see them unless you're in for the very long haul. Stonecutters, though, you may see. These are, again, I believe a dwarven settlement option, and maybe cultic. I'll need to actually double-check this. But these are two-handed swordsmen. Honestly, though, I think the Easterling axe hurlers are probably your better bet if you're in a dwarven settlement, because they're just a little more versatile and a bit better staying power. In elven settlements, you may find Bows of the Shadow, and these, I would imagine, are, again, also cultic. So if you conquer an elven settlement, build it up, remain cultic, then this is a way to address some of the shortcomings of the ranged roster that Rhun experiences. So would definitely recommend these guys. They're going to have better armor, probably better range, definitely better missile attack, and a backup weapon, which is a two-handed axe. In Khand, in addition to the horse archers of Khand that we saw in the last battle, you could train step outriders. These are basically the step outriders that you can get as levies or mercenaries in the area, but these guys are a little bit better than both of those options. So it's just another easy and reliable way for you to pick up horse archers if you want to go that route. And I think that's about it, except for the the ballistas of the Shadow Cult. These are, again, a cultic required unit. If you go into a place like Lond Nurnin, which is the chief city near the Sea of Nirn, you are probably going to see these fairly soon, as there is already a High Temple of the Shadow constructed there that you can begin making use of. You just need to build your barracks up to the right level. This is pretty rare for Rhun, as you can tell. No other siege weapons here, so it's not a bad thing to pick up. If you have the capability to train one while you're cultic, go ahead and do it. But other than that, I think we have covered everything for the Chiefdom of Rhun. So as I said, there's a lot of options here. Going into Dwarven territory, going into Elven territory, going even far afield as Harad or Dunland, going into places like Khand and North Rhun, and watching your roster change and watching all the options open up is one of the great joys of playing the Chiefdom of Rhun, in my opinion. And so I encourage you to give it a shot if you haven't. It's kind of a challenging game, but a very interesting one with always something else opening up as you expand. So thank you very much for joining me, everybody. I'll check you out on the next one. Bye-bye.